They never imagined you'd rise like this. Not just standing, not just surviving, but returning from your silence with a flame that exposes everything fake, fragile, and foul in the shadows around you. You weren't supposed to heal. You weren't supposed to awaken. You weren't supposed to remember who you are. But now that you have, you've become something they never prepared for, a mirror they can't manipulate, and a storm they can't stop. And the question they're too afraid to say out loud is this: what if the very one they tried to break is the one God sent to break the cycle? You see, the danger wasn't in your anger, it was in your alignment. The moment you stopped shrinking, the moment you stopped explaining, the moment you stopped seeking peace with people who were threatened by your purpose, everything shifted. Suddenly, your silence started speaking. Your glow started testifying, and your presence, it started judging every false spirit in the room without you saying a single word. You didn't change to make people uncomfortable. You evolved. And your evolution exposed the comfort they had in pretending. So let me ask you, why do manipulators always feel attacked the moment you walk in, carrying peace they can't counterfeit? That's not coincidence. That's spiritual collision. You've become a living interruption to every unclean agenda around you. And here's what most won't admit. It's not just that they're afraid of you. It's that they remember what they did to you. And they're scared your elevation might come with receipts. But let them squirm. Because this isn't about revenge. This is about revelation. God didn't raise you up to clap back. He raised you up to become the evidence that nothing formed against His chosen ones can prosper. So if you've ever watched people disappear the moment you stopped begging for bare minimum respect, comment 777 right now. Because that silence wasn't rejection. That was heaven making room for your real tribe. And before we go deeper, let me pause and say this from the heart. To every single person who's supported this channel through Super, thanks, thank you. You are not just fueling a voice, you are funding a movement. You are the reason this message keeps reaching the hidden ones who needed confirmation that they're not crazy. They're called. So, I'll leave you with one final question before we go all the way in. What if your presence was never meant to fit in, but to interrupt? What if you weren't sent to be understood, but to be unshakable? Because today, we're about to break open why you, as a healed, aligned, divinely backed, chosen one, are not just dangerous to the darkness. You are the divine disruption it never saw coming. Let's get into it. God's chosen ones. No one has ever been as dangerous as you. Your haters are running scared. Number 1. The moment you took it back. There was a shift, so quiet, no one heard it. Yet it split the spirit realm in two, and it happened the exact moment you stopped playing the victim and started owning your role in the story. What if your greatest awakening wasn't loud, but surgical? What if power doesn't come from rage, but from radical responsibility? That's when you became dangerous, not to the world, but to the structures that fed on your silence. Because when you stopped repeating your pain for pity and started tracing it like a divine roadmap, everything changed. You went from crying for rescue to architecting your resurrection. You became fluent in the language of pain, not as a crutch, but as curriculum. Every wound, tracked. Every heartbreak, interrogated. Every betrayal, held to the mirror until it bled truth. This wasn't healing. This was rebirth. And the ones around you felt it before you even knew what you were becoming. They grew uneasy, not because you harmed them, But because you no longer allowed them to weaponize your suffering, you no longer performed pain for applause. You didn't need applause. You became the sound. Like Joseph in Genesis 50-20, you began to understand what they meant for evil, God intended for good. How many people have secretly hated you simply because you healed without their permission? How many spiritual manipulators thrived off your guilt until they saw you shed it like dead skin? You weren't supposed to grow. You were supposed to stay broken enough to be predictable. But something shifted when you stopped waiting for an apology and chose resurrection instead. There's a reason Jesus healed the man at the pool of Bethesda by asking, "Do you want to be made whole?" John 5-6. Because healing is terrifying to those who are addicted to being pitied. And your yes, your sacred, fully embodied yes to responsibility, lit a fire under the comfort of everyone, still sitting by the water, waiting for someone else to fix them. You didn't just grow, you exposed the lie that growth was impossible. Do you know why they whisper about you now? Why some left quietly and others with venom? Because you reflect what they refuse to face. You're the walking, breathing mirror of what's possible when someone stops blaming the world and starts building from the ashes. Your evolution speaks fluently in a frequency they've tried to avoid their whole lives. And like the prophet Jeremiah, you learn to carry fire in your bones, Jeremiah 20-9, not to burn others, but to awaken purpose. Imagine a forest after fire stripped, rough, charred yet in a year. Green life pushes through soil reborn. That's what you did. You scorched the facade. You buried the fake version of yourself and let truth resurrect you from the root. People aren't scared of your power. They're terrified of your process. Because if you made it through betrayal, abandonment, lies, and loss, and came back softer, smarter, and spiritually sovereign, then what excuse do they have? Nelson Mandela, former South African president and freedom fighter, once said, "I am not a saint. Unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying. You didn't ascend because you were perfect. You ascended because you stopped pretending to be powerless." There's a woman named Lena who once sat in silence for 3 years after her husband left with no warning, her kids growing up watching her shrink. But one morning, she got up, emptied the closet, and instead of crying again, she applied to med school. At 38, people laughed. 10 years later, she's the head of trauma surgery in a major hospital, not because she was fearless, but because she refused to stay frozen. The same spirit lives in you. You remind people that freedom is possible, that healing isn't an accident. It's a decision. You became a fracture in their fantasy. In a world obsessed with blaming others, you are a divine disruption, not loud, not chaotic, just awake. And nothing is more terrifying to the asleep than someone who walks in truth. Your very existence ruins their excuses. Your light exposes their comfort. Like lightning that splits the sky, you don't need to speak. Your presence is the thunder. What if healing wasn't your destination, but your weapon? What if you weren't sent to be light, but to be a revelation? What happens when someone no longer needs revenge to feel complete? When forgiveness becomes armor and grace becomes war paint. That's who you are now. You walk like Christ walked into the temple and flipped the tables calm. Intentional, fierce with purpose. You are dangerous not because you seek vengeance, but because you embody proof. You don't argue anymore. You reveal. You don't beg anymore. You build. And every time you show up in truth, the world trembles just a little more. Number 2. When purity becomes a weapon. Not every war is loud. Some of the most disruptive forces in the spirit realm enter the room without a sound, without a word, and yet everything starts to tremble. You are that kind of presence, the kind that doesn't have to raise a hand to raise the truth. And the more pure your energy becomes, the more contaminated everything around it starts to feel. But what if your silence was never empty, only surgical? What if the unease in their eyes isn't your fault, but their exposure? You carry a frequency that doesn't flatter masks, it shatters them. You don't confront people with words, you confront them with presence. Just as Jesus exposed the Pharisees without chasing them, Matthew 23:27. Your very walk into a room causes those who live behind performance to fidget. They call it intensity. But what they're actually feeling is accountability. You are walking clarity. And when clarity arrives, confusion has to pack up and go. Some rooms get quieter when you enter, not because you're unwanted, but because every unclean thing just got identified. You hold a mirror without holding a grudge. You reflect without even intending to. And that reflection, it stings. Because the people around you often built their entire identity on illusion. What happens when someone who won't play along shows up in a world addicted to performance? What happens when a pure spirit shows up in a room that's built on pretend? Your life resembles the story of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. They didn't die because Peter exposed them. They died because their lies couldn't survive the presence of truth. Your spirit, like Peter's, carries too much weight to tolerate games. That's why people distance themselves after they've wronged you, not because you threatened them, but because your light convicted them. You remind them of what they buried. You remind them of who they were before compromise entered the room. And that's terrifying. Johnny Erickson Tada, a quadriplegic author and Christian speaker, once said, "The weaker we are, the harder we must lean on God, and the harder we lean, the stronger we grow." Her life has shaken millions, not because she screams, but because her peace is disruptive, like you. Here, energy challenges comfort zones. It disturbs false peace. It confronts people who've been living sanitized lies for too long. You're not trying to be confrontational, but confrontation comes when truth walks in skin. Why do you think people ghost you without a reason? Why do friends vanish without fights? Why do they slander you when all you did was stay silent? Because your energy speaks what their words avoid. You didn't accuse them. Their conscience did. You didn't threaten their image. You revealed the cracks in it, just like the prophet Nathan did to David, one sentence. And a kingdom shook, 2 Samuel 12:7. Across town, a man named Kareem worked in finance. Always quiet, always kind. He didn't drink, didn't gossip, didn't chase clout, and that drove his team crazy. One day, a co-worker lied and framed him for a mismanaged account. But when the company ran an internal audit, the integrity of Kareem's record was so clean, it embarrassed the entire department. The report didn't just clear him, it exposed everything they'd been hiding. He never raised his voice. His life did the talking. Your existence is like glacier water in a world drunk on sugar. It tastes too real, too sharp, too alive. What if your purity wasn't weakness, but resistance? What if your refusal to engage in gossip, manipulation, or ego wars is why you've become a walking disruption? Nature doesn't need noise to demand respect. The scent of ozone before a storm, it warns everything nearby that the atmosphere is about to break. That's your presence. People can sense when truth is near, and they either repent or run. The Bible says in Matthew 5-8, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." But it doesn't mention what happens to those who can't handle that sight. Some people don't hate your spirit. They fear what it might reveal in theirs. And so they run, not from you, from the mirror you became. Cardinal Robert Sarah, a Catholic theologian and author, once wrote, "The more a man is united to God, the more his presence disturbs the forces of darkness. That's your life, a walking disturbance to everything unclean, a holy interruption to cycles of deception. You are not too much. You are the right amount of truth in a world addicted to performance. That's why they say you've changed. That's why they twist your name when they can't twist your spirit. That's why you've become a trigger, not because you're dangerous, but because you remind them of everything they promised they'd become, but never did. You didn't come to blend in. You came to bring divine disruption." Number 3. You broke the rule, and that broke them. Some prisons don't have bars, just expectations, quiet agreements, unspoken rules whispered into your spirit like lullabies. Stay small, stay soft, don't rise too high, don't shine too bright. You didn't sign that contract, but they expected you to honor it anyway. And when you finally disobeyed it, when you refused to keep shrinking just to make others feel tall, everything around you shifted, not because you betrayed anyone, but because you refused to betray yourself. Have you ever noticed how the ones who once cheered for you get quiet when you start winning on your own terms? Have you ever wondered why people who prayed for your healing now avoid your wholeness? The moment you stood tall, you violated the one thing their ego relied on: your silence. Your struggle made them feel superior. Your pain propped up their confidence. But your growth, that felt like rebellion. Your journey echoes the life of David long before he became king. In 1 Samuel 18-7, after he slayed Goliath, the women sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." And in that moment, Saul, once supportive, turned into a silent enemy. Why? Because David's greatness exposed Saul's insecurity. And that's exactly what your evolution does. You didn't change to offend them, but your awakening revealed how shallow their confidence really was. It only thrived when you stayed beneath them. Your light didn't shame them. It just made their excuses more obvious. In homes where compliance is mistaken for love, any hint of autonomy feels like betrayal. You grew up in systems where speaking truth meant being labeled disrespectful, where doing better was seen as disloyalty, where dimming yourself was the price of being accepted. But what happens when survival isn't enough? What happens when your soul starts gasping for oxygen and you stop apologizing for needing more? Simone Biles, Olympic gymnast, survivor, and symbol of bold boundaries, once stepped away from competition, saying, "I have to focus on my mental health." She broke the unspoken rule that black women must always be strong, always be invincible, and she was demonized for it. But in breaking that rule, she became a global force. You did the same. You stopped apologizing for your healing, and suddenly, you were too much. A man named Tobias once worked quietly as a janitor at a private university. Always kind, always invisible, until he started writing poems during his lunch break, and one professor noticed. A year later, his first book was published. The faculty who used to nod politely now avoid eye contact. He didn't change how he treated them, he just stopped hiding his brilliance. That's what you did. You chose life. And some people only loved you when you were dying slowly. Have you ever asked why growth triggers guilt in those who refuse to evolve? Have you considered that your confidence doesn't offend them, it exposes their avoidance? The moment you stopped playing small, they lost control. And when people can't guilt you, shame you, or emotionally manipulate you back into submission, they panic. That's not your rebellion. That's your resurrection. The Israelites experienced this after leaving Egypt as long as they were enslaved. Pharaoh fed them, but the moment they stepped into freedom, they became a threat. Exodus 14:5. You are walking that same path. Freedom costs you comfort. Yes, but it also reveals who was only comfortable when you weren't. Picture the eagle, not the common bird, but the kind that soars above storms. Eagles don't flap like pigeons. They glide, they rise, not because they're arrogant, but because they're built different. When your altitude changes, don't be shocked when people start gasping for breath around you. Luke 9:62 says, "No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God." You didn't just evolve, you stopped looking back, and in doing so, you shattered the illusion that they had authority over your destiny. That's what makes you so dangerous. Not that you fight, but that you don't fold. Cardinal Raniero, Canta la Mesa, preacher to 3 popes, once said, "Holiness is not never falling. It is always getting up." And you got up, again and again. Even when they hoped you'd stay on the floor, you got up without applause, without validation, without permission. You didn't break the rule because you're rebellious. You broke it because it was suffocating you. You disobeyed the lie that said, being loved means being small. And now you walk in a freedom they were never taught to understand. So they run. Not because you're cruel, but because you stopped playing the role they cast you in. You're not dangerous because you changed. You're dangerous because you refused to ask for permission to live. Number 4. The mirror that wouldn't break. You weren't supposed to survive, let alone reflect. They expected you to stay buried in the grief they left you in. They assumed their betrayal would mute you permanently. But when you rose unbothered, focused, whole, it wasn't your comeback that stung. It was what your life revealed about their choices. You became the one thing they couldn't escape, a mirror. And no matter how many stones they throw, you don't shatter, because this isn't glass, this is divine clarity. What if the real offense wasn't your healing, but their guilt? What if your peace doesn't just confuse them, it convicts them? You didn't show up to prove a point, but your progress made one anyway. They tried to distort your story, twist your intentions, dismiss your grace, not because of what you've done to them, but because of what your life says about them. You evolved while they stayed rehearsing the same old pain. You healed while they kept making trauma their personality. And that contrast, that's unbearable. Like Joseph's brothers in Genesis 50-18, they came back, not with pride, but bunits. Not because Joseph harmed them, but because his power made their betrayal look pathetic. Your strength makes their excuses unravel. You became dangerous not by force, but by becoming everything they swore you couldn't. And when people see you rise from places they've chosen to sink in, bitterness becomes easier than ownership. Have you noticed how those who hurt you often become your loudest critics? Have you seen how those who ghosted you now gossip about you? Why does your peace bother people who never gave you any? The answer is simple. Because your progress makes them confront what they refuse to change. Your focus reflects their distraction. Your calm highlights their internal chaos. And your rise? It exposes the shortcuts they tried to use to cheat a process you endured. You didn't rise to mock anyone. But like Daniel in Babylon, your integrity became intolerable. Daniel 6-4. They searched for dirt on you and found nothing. So they created lies instead. Because when someone has built their identity on being above you, your transformation feels like a threat, especially when you didn't beg, break, or barter your way forward. In the hills of rural Italy, a woman named Chiara left an abusive home at 17 with no money and no name. She lived in silence, cleaning the convent floors. But by 30, she was teaching theology at a university, fluent in 5 languages. Scars still visible, but spirit unshakable. People from her past whisper that she got lucky, but luck never taught her Greek. Grace did. That's what people miss. Your glow doesn't come from performance. It comes from pressure. Actor and activist Viola Davis once said, "The only thing that separates women of color from anyone else is opportunity. But you created your own opportunity, and that's what disturbs people, not your confidence. But the fact that no one handed it to you, you were forged in fire, not flattery, molded by storms, not applause. That kind of foundation can't be erased by slander." In 2 Corinthians 4:8-9, Paul writes, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, struck down, bit, not destroyed." That's you, not just surviving, lies thriving in the open, without shame, without needing to clap back. Your very existence is the clap back. That's why they spin narratives. They need the story to make sense, but your success ruined the one they wrote. Have you ever seen lava cool into obsidian? It's sharp, dark, gleaming, born from heat, but unbreakable. That's your presence, smooth on the surface, but forged in fire. Or consider deep-sea coral. It grows in darkness, without applause, and becomes a kingdom all its own. You did the same. They tried to define you by the pain they caused, but you made that pain your platform. Psalm 118:22 says, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." That's your legacy. They tried to erase you. God turned you into a foundation. You're not dangerous because you retaliated. You're dangerous because you reflect. Your success is a mirror. Your peace is a mirror. Your restraint is a mirror. And they can't destroy what they refuse to face. They'll say you changed, but what really happened is you stopped hiding. And the truth is, they never hated you. They hated the part of themselves you refused to carry for them. Number 5, you became the revenge they never saw coming. Some reflections can't be smashed, others can't be ignored. And then there's the rarest kind, the ones that transform into prophecy. That's you. They couldn't silence the mirror, so they hoped to destroy the life behind it. But your rise wasn't a retaliation, it was a revelation. While they were scripting your destruction, heaven was rewriting your legacy. And you didn't need revenge. You became it. Can we be honest? How many nights did you cry thinking the betrayal would break you? How many times did you wonder if the lies would stick? If the shame would stain permanently? They counted on your collapse. But what if the collapse they prayed for became the platform God used to elevate you? They didn't predict that your silence would echo louder than their slander, that your peace would haunt louder than any comeback ever could, like Esther. You were supposed to be forgotten in the shadows, but while Haman plotted in secret, God was preparing your moment in plain sight. Esther 6:1. They lied. They manipulated. They used your past like a leash, dragging your name through rooms you never even stepped into. But grace doesn't ask for permission. God didn't consult their gossip before crowning your purpose. When Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, they assumed his story ended in that pit. But the same God who watched him cry in the silence of rejection raised him to rule in the same land meant to kill him. Genesis 41:41. Sound familiar? You rose in silence. No headlines. No revenge tour. Just favor flowing in unseen places. That kind of victory, it makes their curses irrelevant. Nobel Peace Prize winner and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel once said, "The opposite of love is not hate. It's indifference. That's the most dangerous thing about you now. You stopped needing to be understood. You stopped needing them to regret. You stopped needing them. Period. And that's what they can't handle: your lack of need, your peace, your detachment." A man named Darius was wrongfully fired after refusing to cover for financial fraud in his company. No confrontation, no lawsuit. He went silent, studied at night, and built a startup in his garage. 6 years later, he acquired the same firm that let him go. When he visited the old office, he didn't gloat. He just walked through quietly, blessing the space. That's the kind of healing they can't recover from. That's what you embody. Why does your glow provoke people who tried to dim you? Why does your stillness enrage those addicted to chaos? Could it be that your elevation reminds them of the collapse they denied in themselves? Could it be that your joy is louder than any justification they've rehearsed for years? Psalm 23:5 declares, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." That verse isn't poetic, it's prophetic. Every moment you laugh freely, every step you take without bitterness, every door that opens without explanation. It's a meal served hot in front of every person who swore you'd never get up again. But here you are, feasting without flinching. You didn't just survive. You evolved without malice. You transcended without revenge. Like Jesus, hanging on the cross in Luke 23:34. You didn't say, "I'll get even." You said, "Father, forgive them." And that kind of grace, that kind of restraint, it's lethal to people who need you to be angry so they can feel justified in their guilt. Look at the way rivers flow. They don't argue with rocks, they just move around them. Over time, they carve entire canyons through stone, not by force, but by persistence. That's you. Steady, silent, devastating in your direction. Or consider how bamboo grows. It spends years building roots underground before bursting upward. Your rise felt sudden to them, but heaven knows you were preparing long before they ever betrayed you. Romans 12:19 says, "Do not take revenge. It is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord." That's not just scripture. That's your strategy. You let God be your vindicator, and He did more than defend you. He elevated you. You're not dangerous because you got even. You're dangerous because you didn't have to. You didn't become like them. You became something they could never comprehend, healed, of whole, and holy. They expected fire from your wounds, but you brought water. You turned your pain into peace, and that's what they'll never be able to imitate. Number 6, you broke the illusion, and that broke their power. Not all chains are physical. Some are built from silence, guilt, and emotional blackmail. But something inside you shifted. You didn't just grow stronger, you woke up. You realized the hands that held you down were never bigger than your calling. They just looked powerful because you had forgotten who you were. But the moment you saw clearly, everything collapsed, not just around you, but within them. That was the day their influence died. Have you ever wondered how much control they truly had? Or if it was just your fear that made them look invincible? What happens when the person they manipulated no longer exists? When you stopped walking on eggshells, did you notice how quickly they tripped over their own lies? The truth is, they never had power. You gave it to them while you were still bleeding from wounds they helped create. But not anymore. In Luke 4-6, Satan offered Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, saying, "I will give you all their authority. It has been given to me." But Jesus saw through the illusion. He knew the devil's so-called power was only borrowed, and you've reached that same discernment. You see through false altars now. What used to intimidate you now looks like a desperate bluff, like Moses before Pharaoh. You no longer tremble at the throne of men who pretend to be gods. Exodus 7-1. Pharaoh's might wasn't real. It was propped up by fear, sustained by silence. But the moment Moses obeyed God and spoke up, Egypt started to crumble. Your words, your presence, your alignment, they carry that same quake now. You don't yell. You don't argue. But the truth you walk in makes entire systems panic. When you stand tall, do you notice how their posture weakens? Why does your clarity make manipulators fumble? Could it be that your discernment is revealing how empty their strategies really are? The guilt trips no longer land. The gaslighting doesn't confuse you. The energy shifts don't catch you off guard. They confirm what you already discerned. Author and humanitarian Maya Angelou once said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." And you did, not with bitterness, but with vision. You stopped explaining your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped breaking your back to carry relationships that couldn't handle your boundaries. That wasn't rebellion. That was remembrance of who God said you were. Isaiah 54:17 proclaims, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." That includes spiritual manipulation, emotional warfare, and the subtle violence of shame. They tried every tactic, and now they're frustrated not because you attacked, but because you disengaged. They expected retaliation. You gave them silence. They wanted chaos. You moved with strategy. In Judges 16, Samson didn't lose his power when Delilah cut his hair. He lost it when he stopped protecting what was sacred. But you learned from that. You stopped handing over your peace just to keep the illusion alive. And that's why you're dangerous now. You guard your oil, your voice, your spirit like treasure. They thought you'd be predictable forever. But that version of you died in the fire. A woman named Yasmin once stayed in a toxic relationship for 6 years, constantly manipulated through scripture, guilt, and control, until one day, mid-conversation, she paused, looked him in the eye, and said, "This isn't God. This is fear dressed as love." She walked away with nothing but her Bible and never looked back. 2 years later, she runs a women's shelter for survivors of religious abuse. That's what clarity does. It doesn't shout. It liberates. Why are they so quiet now? Why do the people who once felt bigger than life seem small in hindsight? Could it be that their power only existed in the parts of you that were still unhealed? You've been through the fire, and you didn't just survive, you analyzed it, took notes, built armor, came back, unbothered. Your presence now is like volcanic soil, rich, fertile, born from what once tried to destroy you, or like a glacier slow, steady, massive beneath the surface. What they see is only a fraction of the depth you now carry. Romans 8:30 asks, if God is for us, who can be against us? That's not a question. It's a verdict. They weren't powerful. They were just loud. And now that you walk in revelation, they don't know how to approach you. Your calm is confrontational. Your peace is disruptive. Your wisdom is warfare. You're not dangerous because you fight dirty. You're dangerous because you stopped fighting altogether and started discerning instead. And in a world ruled by illusion, discernment is death to every false king. Number 7. You're not just intelligent, you're spiritually invasive. You used to second-guess your intuition. You used to wonder if you were just doing too much. But now you know the truth. What they called paranoia was prophecy in disguise. What they mocked as overthinking was your divine radar scanning what couldn't be spoken. You don't wait for masks to fall. You read the fracture lines behind the smile. You catch the war in someone's tone before the battle begins. How many times have you sensed something before it happened, only to watch it unfold exactly as you felt it? Why do your gut instincts disturb people who claim to have nothing to hide? Could it be that what makes you unsettling is that you listen to more than words, you read the whole atmosphere? 1 Kings 3 tells us that Solomon didn't ask for riches or long life. He asked for discernment to understand what lies beneath the surface. God honored that. And through that wisdom, Solomon exposed 2 women's hearts with a single judgment. 1 Kings 3:16-28. You carry that same gift. You don't need proof to know the truth. You don't need confession to feel corruption. You just know. You remember when Jesus said to the woman at the well in John 4:18, "You have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband." He didn't condemn her. He saw her. That's you. You don't expose to shame. You expose to liberate. But liberation terrifies those who profit from deception. People often avoid you, not because you've done anything, but because their lies evaporate in your presence. Your peace stirs their panic. Your silence makes their secrets louder. You don't confront. You simply show up with so much truth in your energy that it makes the performance impossible. The prophet Elisha had this kind of insight in 2 Kings 6:12. The king of Aram asked, "Who among us is the spy?" But one servant said, "It's Elisha." He tells the king of Israel, "The very words you speak in your bedroom." That's how you feel to people walking in manipulation. Your spiritual Wi-Fi stays connected, and they hate that you're already 3 moves ahead. Alicia Keys, the Grammy-winning artist, once shared in an interview that she often senses people's motives before they open their mouths. She said, "I can feel energy shift when someone's intentions change. I don't need them to speak it." That's what happens when presence becomes perception. You stop being surprised and start being strategic. Maya was a trauma counselor who'd grown up in a house full of secrets and silence. As an adult, she could read people's pain by the way they laughed. One day, during a therapy session, a client smiled mid-sentence while talking about abuse. Maya didn't interrupt. She just said, "That wasn't funny, was it?" And the client broke down. That's the level you operate on, where the vibe speaks louder than the vocabulary. Have you noticed how often people say, "I feel exposed around you"? Even when you've said nothing, why do your questions seem to cut deeper than their rehearsed answers? What is it about your gaze that unsettles those who depend on illusion to survive? Isaiah 11:3. 4 says of the Spirit of God, "He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions." That's the energy you carry, decision-making beyond sight, intuition beyond reason. You don't guess. You discern. Consider owls. These nocturnal hunters hear movement beneath the soil. They fly in silence. But their perception is surgical. Or look at octopuses. They can detect changes in vibration and light that we can't even register. Your spirit is built like that. still on the outside, but hyper-attuned on the inside. You don't make noise, yet your presence roars. You don't accuse, yet truth leaks from your spirit. You don't seek confrontation, but the lies can't breathe when you walk in. You make deceivers sweat, not because you're dangerous in action, but because you're accurate in knowing you aren't here to be fooled. You're here to pierce the veil. And that kind of sight, it's divine warfare. Because in a world thriving on pretense, spiritual discernment isn't just rare, it's revolutionary. Number 8. You're spiritually expensive, and they can't afford the real you. Some people can't handle being near you. Not because you're arrogant, not because you're unkind, but because you are spiritually expensive, not in ego, not in pride, but in depth. Your energy costs truth. Your presence costs growth. And for people addicted to illusion, you're too much truth in one place. You don't demand payment, but transformation is the toll at every gate you guard. That's why they can't stay. Have you ever noticed how your silence unsettles those who live in pretense? Why do people avoid eye contact when you're around, even when no one's accused them of anything? Could it be that your alignment exposes their avoidance, that your integrity reveals their performance? Jesus said in Matthew 10:34, "I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." That wasn't about violence. It was about truth cutting through convenience. That's you. You don't confront people with anger, but your clarity slices through the fake like a blade. Your peace doesn't pacify, it purifies. And for those still thriving in shallow waters, your depth is dangerous. Like Nathan standing before King David in 2 Samuel 12. You carry the courage to hold a mirror. Nathan didn't yell. He simply told a story, and the story exposed the sin. That's the kind of weight your presence carries. People confess things around you they never meant to speak, not because you interrogate them, but because your spirit makes the lies too heavy to hold. They say you're too intense, but what they really mean is, you make me uncomfortable in my own skin. They label you too much. But what they're avoiding is the cost of authenticity. That's the spiritual invoice you carry. To be around you is to face themselves, and most aren't ready to pay that price. In Acts 8, Simon the sorcerer offered money to buy the power of the Holy Spirit, but Peter shut it down immediately. "May your money perish with you," he said, "because you thought you could buy the gift of God." Acts 8:20. That's how they treat your light. They want the glow without the grind, the presence without the process. But spiritual weight can't be borrowed. It must be earned in fire. Malik was a corporate coach, known for his calm presence. Executives would start confessing their business fraud, emotional burnout, and moral failures just by sitting across from him. One CEO even asked, "Why do I feel like I'm being seen for the first time?" Malik never pried. His soul just made the lies too heavy to breathe. That's what you do. You detox rooms just by showing up. Why do they distance themselves after saying they admired you? Why do they label you judgmental when you never judged? Could it be that what they're really running from is the truth that being near you requires them to grow, and they're not ready? Desmond Tutu, the South African archbishop and truth advocate who helped dismantle apartheid, once said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." That's your presence. It won't allow neutrality. It won't let people stay comfortable in compromise. You don't force people to choose sides. You just make it impossible for them to keep pretending they never had to. Your spirit isn't draining. It's revealing. Your presence doesn't take energy. It extracts toxins. You don't leave people exhausted. You leave them exposed. And exposure always offends those invested in illusion. Psalm 24:3-4 asks, "Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? He who has clean hands and a pure heart." You walk like that. And for people holding on to filth, your altitude gives them spiritual nosebleeds. You're not on a pedestal, you're on assignment. And the elevation isn't pride. It's proximity to God. That's why the air around you feels thin. You cost clarity. You cost confession. Like deep ocean currents that move entire ecosystems without making a sound. You alter every atmosphere you enter, or like the silent moon that pulls tides without touching a single wave. Your gravity shifts everything near you, even when they don't understand how or why. You were never meant to be cheap. You were meant to be costly. You carry insight that exposes illusions, wisdom that deflates egos, love that purifies everything it touches. And the closer they get to you, the more they feel the pressure of what they haven't dealt with. That's not your problem. That's your power. You're not intimidating. You're transformational. And only those ready to surrender the lie can afford your truth. Number 9. You don't need validation. You are the evidence. They thought your silence was weakness, but you were simply being shaped in the unseen. While they measured worth by applause, you were being anointed in anonymity. They watched platforms. You built alts. And now that you've emerged, they don't know what to do with someone who didn't need their stage to rise. Because you didn't beg to be seen. You became undeniable. Have you noticed how uncomfortable people get when they can't take credit for your glow up? Why does your quiet strength irritate the ones who used to dismiss you? What if the truth is, you're not seeking validation because you are the validation? In Exodus 3, Moses didn't ask Pharaoh for permission to walk in his calling. He didn't need Egypt's validation to be God's instrument. His burning bush moment wasn't a public performance, it was a private awakening. That's you. Your fire didn't come from followers. It came from being refined in hidden furnaces. Your scars are sacred proof. Like Hannah in 2 Samuel 2. Your prayers were mocked before they were manifested, but God saw the weeping. God heard the groans. And when the promise was fulfilled, no applause was necessary. Because favor speaks for itself. It doesn't need press. It carries presence. You don't walk into rooms to be noticed. You are the room shifter. And when you speak, dimensions respond. There was a woman named Charisse, an orphan turned trauma therapist. For years, people overlooked her because she didn't come from prestige. But every client she healed, every soul she reached, whispered her name in places her feet had never walked. One day, she was invited to consult for global leaders, not because she campaigned, but because her work did the talking. That's what your life is doing now. Malcolm Gladwell, journalist and author of Outliers, once said, "Practice isn't the thing you do once you're good. It's the thing you do that makes you good." What they called isolation was actually calibration. You weren't being buried, you were being built. In Matthew 3:17, before Jesus performed any miracle, the heavens opened, and God declared, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." He was approved in identity before he ever displayed ability. That's why your worth was never tied to performance. You were validated before the fruit. In the root. Why do they gossip, diminish, or ignore what you carry now? Could it be they sense what they tried to delay has arrived anyway? That favor skipped their permission, that your strength was forged in places they never had the courage to walk through. The eagle doesn't fly for applause. Its wings were made for higher altitudes. Or look at the volcano. It doesn't ask for attention, but when it erupts, the whole landscape changes. You're not loud, but your impact is seismic. You move in quiet conviction, and that movement speaks louder than noise ever could. You no longer crave inclusion. You are the distinction. You no longer chase rooms. You become the standard. And the people who once called you delusional now whisper your name in disbelief. You didn't force your way in. You elevated until the room had no choice but to notice. They can't box what heaven built. You were underestimated by design, mocked by assignment, hidden on purpose. But now you are living proof that divine validation needs no earthly stamp, and nothing is more dangerous than someone who finally knows it. Number 10. You were sent to interrupt patterns, not participate in them. They called you the black sheep, the troublemaker, the too sensitive one. But what if you were never the problem? What if your discomfort wasn't dysfunction, but discernment? From the beginning, you felt out of place in rooms that praised silence over truth, tradition over transformation, comfort over correction. And now you know why. You weren't born to perpetuate the pattern. You were born to break it. Have you ever wondered why the family secrets burned in your chest while others wore them like badges of tradition? Why did you ask the questions no one else dared to voice? Why couldn't you just let it go when everyone told you to move on without healing? In Judges 6, Gideon was hiding in a winepress when God called him a mighty warrior. Why? Because he was the one who dared to ask, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" Judges 6:13. That one question revealed the courage in him to confront the cycle of oppression. Just like Gideon, you weren't anointed to hide, you were anointed to disrupt. Your presence unsettles systems built on dysfunction. Not because you are loud, but because your spirit carries truth like wildfire, and truth, by nature, is confrontational. It scorches the walls people build to protect their denial. Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet, not because he was weak, but because he cried over people too numb to feel what was killing them. Like him, your sensitivity is sacred. You don't just see the brokenness, you grieve it. And that grief has become your divine compass for change. Jesus didn't come into a world that wanted healing. He came into a world that crucified him for exposing their sickness. In Matthew 10:35, he said, "I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, not to sow hate, but to sever idolatry to generational bondage." What they called rebellion was actually revelation. That's you. You see through it. And the moment you name it, the system targets you, not because you're wrong, but because you're awake. Amira grew up in a household where women were taught to stay quiet, endure abuse, and smile through suffering. But she couldn't. At 16, she confronted her uncle about his behavior toward her cousin and got banished from family gatherings for causing division. Years later, her cousin told her, "Your voice saved me. That's the cost of your presence. It may isolate you temporarily, but it will liberate someone eternally." Pope John Paul II, a fierce advocate for human dignity during communist rule, once said, "Freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought." You weren't sent here to blend in. You were sent to confront what others have bowed to. Your sense of justice isn't an attitude, it's a divine assignment. What do you call a person who won't let the lie continue? Who speaks what no one else dares to name? Who stands up even when shaking? You call them dangerous. You call them disruptive. You call them chosen, like the earthquake. You don't arrive quietly, but when you're done, nothing is ever the same again, or like a storm that breaks open stale air. You don't destroy for the sake of destruction, you stir what's stagnant, so healing can begin. They label you dramatic, confrontational, ungrateful. But the truth is, you're disruptive because you won't let sickness be normalized. You refuse to swallow secrets that rot the spirit. You challenge the family code of silence, the cultural pressure to conform, the spiritual apathy that keeps people shackled. Why do they treat your truth like it's betrayal? Could it be that what they call peace is actually avoidance? That what they call unity is just silence disguised as love? You weren't sent to keep things comfortable. You were sent to make things clean. And cleanliness requires confrontation. Holiness demande disruption. You're not here for applause. You're here for legacy. For the children who will never have to fight what you did. For the siblings who will feel safe to tell the truth. For the future that will breathe free because you chose to confront what others concealed. You don't carry the curse. You carry the courage to crush it. Number 11. They weren't prepared for the version of you that doesn't care to be liked. Something changed the moment you stopped begging for peace that cost you your voice. You woke up from the hypnosis of people-pleasing, and the ripple it sent through your relationships was deafening. Not because you became mean, not because you stopped loving, but because you finally refused to perform for acceptance. And that kind of awakening doesn't come quietly. It rattles every dynamic built on your silence. Why did it shake them so badly when you started saying no without an explanation? What made them so uneasy the moment you stopped over-explaining your heart? Could it be that their connection to you was never love, but leverage? You used to contort yourself to avoid conflict. The old version of you would shrink, apologize, smile through disrespect just to keep the temperature low. But healing matured you. Now you understand that false peace is just chaos with pretty makeup. And truth doesn't owe politeness when it's being suffocated. Like Jesus in Luke 4:28-30. You no longer stay where you're not welcome. When the crowd in his hometown turned on him for speaking truth they didn't want to hear, he walked straight through them untouched. Unapologetic. Unshaken. That's the version of you that terrifies people. The one that walks away clean. You carry the spirit of Elijah, the prophet who refused to water down the truth to make kings comfortable. In 1 Kings 18, he stood alone on Mount Carmel and confronted a nation's compromise. You have that same mantle now, not to please crowds, but to call altars back to fire. That kind of clarity doesn't whisper, it pierces. Cassandra, a high-powered attorney, spent years as the nice one, the peacemaker who absorbed blame to hold her family together. But therapy taught her the cost of that role. One day, she declined to mediate yet another family argument. And suddenly, she became the problem. But she didn't flinch. She told them calmly, if my silence was the glue, then maybe it was time for it all to fall apart. Oh, that's where you are now. You're not rejecting people. You're rejecting patterns. And when people realize they can no longer bait you with guilt or bind you with approval, they panic, not because you're cruel, but because you're no longer controllable. Brené Brown, a research professor and best-selling author on vulnerability and courage, once said, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Your boundaries may feel brutal to those used to your blurred lines, but they're mercy in disguise. They teach people the language of honor, even if they have to learn it the hard way. Have you noticed how the air shifts when you no longer overfunction in undernourished spaces? Why do people who never invested in your wholeness feel entitled to your access? Could it be that your independence exposes the emotional debts they never intended to pay? The porcupine doesn't lash out. It protects itself, and like that, you've become a spiritual porcupine, soft interior, guarded exterior. Not to harm, but to preserve the sanctuary you've built inside. Or think of the sunflower. It doesn't apologize for turning away from the dark. It simply realigns itself toward the light. That's what you've done. Even in Scripture, John the Baptist wasn't admired for diplomacy. He was respected for truth. He didn't smooth the edges of his message to fit social norms. And when he called out Herod's sin, he wasn't rewarded. He was imprisoned. But his voice echoed in eternity. You're not harsh. You're healed. You're not bitter. You're boundary built. And those who miss the performative version of you aren't mourning your distance. They're mourning their lost control. But you've made peace with that. You're not here to be understood by everyone. You're here to be aligned with truth. And sometimes, truth stands alone. That kind of clarity may cost you admiration, but it buys you freedom. And nothing is more dangerous than a person who has made peace with being disliked if it means being whole. Number 12. You walk with God, and that terrifies every manipulator in disguise. You don't walk with noise. You walk with presence. And that's what unsettles them. You don't need to wear religion on your sleeve to carry authority. The power that walks with you isn't performative. It's spiritual alignment. When you enter a room, you don't need to speak in tongues, hold a Bible, or shout down falsehoods. Your spirit does the talking. You are evidence that intimacy with God is a frequency, not a flex. And manipulators hate that frequency because it exposes what they buried beneath charm, flattery, and fake humility. Why do the most passive-aggressive people suddenly grow silent around you? What makes manipulators lose their grip when you say nothing at all? Could it be that your stillness is spiritual warfare they never saw coming? The prophet Daniel didn't fight back when they conspired against him. He didn't beg the king or slander his enemies. He simply remained faithful, and God shut the mouths of lions. Daniel 6:22. You carry that same kind of divine immunity while others plot behind your back. Heaven reroutes every weapon. It's not that you're untouchable. It's that you're covered. When Joseph was thrown into a pit by his own brothers, slandered by Potiphar's wife, and left to rot in a prison cell, not once did he retaliate. He walked with God. And the result? Genesis 50:20. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. You walk in that same oil, what they meant to ruin you. Heaven is using to promote you. Take the story of Arman, a youth pastor in Brooklyn who never defended himself when someone in his circle accused him of misusing funds. He stayed silent, kept serving, and trusted the process. A year later, the accuser confessed. The ministry doubled, and Arman was elevated to lead 5 church campuses. He didn't need revenge. He needed obedience. As Pope Shenouda III, former head of the Coptic Orthodox Church, once said, "Do not defend yourself. Let God do that. He knows what to do, how to do it, and when to do it." That is the energy you carry now. They tried character assassination. It failed. They tried narrative distortion. It collapsed. Not because you're slick, but because God doesn't lose. The snow leopard doesn't announce itself. It moves in silence. camouflaged and majestic. But when it strikes, it does so with precision. That's you. And like the oak tree, you didn't grow fast, but you grew rooted, and now your shade exposes who only stood beside you when you were a seed. You didn't come to play in their politics. You came to pull down strongholds. You weren't sent to please fragile egos. You were assigned to shift atmospheres, and that kind of power doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through fruit. Doors open without campaigns. Respect follows without performance, and impact remains even when you leave the room. Why do they still watch your every move while pretending not to care? What makes them so frustrated every time your name still opens doors they tried to shut? Could it be that they can't grasp your favor because they don't know its source? They wonder why you keep rising while their schemes keep collapsing. It's simple. You're not hustling your way up. You're being carried. Isaiah 45:2 says, I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. And that's exactly what's happening. They see the elevation, but they don't see the oil. They hear your name, but they don't know the nights you wept in prayer. You don't retaliate because you're not competing. You're consecrated. Your silence is louder than their lies. Your grace under pressure is proof that your covering is not from man, it's divine. And no matter what trap they set, what rumor they start, or what door they try to slam, truth always rises. They can't manipulate your spirit. They can't weaponize your past. They can't sabotage what heaven already approved, because you don't walk alone. You walk with God, and that's why they tremble. Number 13. They tried to treat you like a pawn, but you were the entire blueprint. They tried to treat you like a pawn, a disposable piece in a game they thought they were smart enough to control. You were underestimated from the start, seen as compliant, predictable, obedient, but they didn't realize you were never part of their strategy. You were the divine blueprint the whole time. How long did they think you would sit quietly while they pulled the strings? What made them so confident that their manipulation could rewrite the calling on your life? You let them believe they were in control. You moved silently. Not because you were naive, but because you were observant, strategic. You studied the layout of the board, took note of every pattern, every tactic, every lie dressed as loyalty. They thought your loyalty meant blindness, but you were 10 moves ahead. Operating with spiritual discernment they didn't even recognize as dangerous. While they manipulated in the flesh, you aligned in the spirit. And alignment with God is always stronger than alliance with man. Just like Esther, who hid her identity and influence until the moment of divine reversal. Esther 4:14. You were prepared behind closed doors for a moment of exposure that would change everything. She was never meant to be decorative. She was the disruption. And just like Nehemiah, who surveyed the brokenness of his people in silence before rebuilding it with strategy and conviction, Nehemiah 2:12, you kept your plans to yourself until it was time to rise. And when you moved, it wasn't a reaction, it was revelation. They saw you as fragile, easy to manipulate, but like David stepping out in front of Goliath, you didn't bring weapons. They understood. You brought divine clarity, as it's written in 1 Samuel 17:45. You come to me with sword and spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. You didn't need their tools. You had the anointing, and that terrified them. You were never just another piece. You were the prototype. They confused your quietness for fear, your stillness for stagnation. But have they ever watched a chameleon under pressure? It blends into its environment, not to conform, but to survive long enough to strike in silence, or a spider, weaving a web invisibly, while its prey dances arrogantly into its own trap. You moved with that kind of patience, that kind of precision. You didn't need to announce your every thought. You weren't performing for their applause. And that's what made you dangerous. Because, while they gossiped, you were growing. While they plotted, you were preparing. While they tried to corner you like a pawn, you were mapping out an exit that would elevate you beyond their reach. They never expected someone like Kayla, a soft-spoken developer from Detroit, to disrupt their entire infrastructure. She spent years being ignored in boardrooms, spoken over in meetings, but silently. She was building an app that would disrupt the very company that dismissed her. When she launched it on her own and outsold their platform, they scrambled to claim ownership, but it was too late. She wasn't the intern. She was the architect, the blueprint. Evan Benedict Cumberbatch, a British actor celebrated for playing thinkers and tacticians, once said, "The further you go with the truth, the clearer everything becomes. But it comes at a cost, because most people prefer illusion. That illusion is what you shattered. That false system built on hierarchy, manipulation, and performance. It cracked the moment you stopped playing their game. And now they're left speechless, because what they tried to bury rose with divine timing. What they called disposable is now undeniable. They didn't realize they were never managing you. They were misreading you. You weren't just in the room. You were sent to shift it. The irony is this: the one they thought they could control is the very one God is using to dismantle the system they worshipped. You don't need revenge. You've got revelation. You don't need to shout. Your elevation speaks for itself. You were never the pawn. You were the prophecy in motion. Number 14. They're running because they finally realized you're not the one. You're the warning. They thought you were just another moment, another body, another soul they could twist, test, and toss aside when they were done pretending. But you weren't just a passing presence, you were a divine interruption. The moment you entered their life, the countdown began. A countdown not to destruction, but to revelation. You weren't placed in their path for decoration. You were sent as a final divine checkpoint, and instead of honoring it, they mocked it. But what happens when people laugh in the face of grace? What made them so confident that you were just another phase? Why did they assume they could violate something sacred and not reap the consequence? Did they really think God would remain silent when they mistreated what he covered? You came softly, but your presence had weight. You didn't demand. You discerned. You didn't arrive with thunder, but with divine assignment. Like the prophet Nathan entering David's palace not to flatter the king, but to confront sin. In 2 Samuel 12, Nathan told David, "You are the man," and it broke the king's soul. That's what your presence did to them. You exposed what they never wanted to see. You didn't even have to raise your voice. You just walked in alignment. And alignment brings accountability. Your story echoes the warning of Matthew 10:40. Whoever receives you receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. They didn't just reject you, they rejected something higher. That's why the weight of consequence is spiritual, not circumstantial. And now, they're restless. Their guilt has shape, their fear has breath, and their memory of you has teeth. You were never just a soft soul. You were a test of character. You were a portal for change, just like Jesus in his own hometown, Luke 4. You were familiar to them, so they dismissed your wisdom. scoffed at your depth. But the moment you left, miracles moved with you, and now they're haunted by everything they could have experienced. Had they only honored what they were given. Look at the way Carmen, a non-profit director in São Paulo, was treated by her board. They thought her insistence on ethical practices was too intense. They mocked her transparency, ignored her warnings about misallocated funds, and when she left quietly, no one thought twice. Until 6 months later, an audit exposed what her spirit had sensed all along. She wasn't the problem. She was the warning, and they failed it. Even the great Zadie Smith, novelist and professor, once said, "The essence of privilege is that you do not recognize a warning when it whispers. You demand it scream, then blame it when it does. That's the cycle you broke. You didn't scream, but now your success is screaming for you. Your breakthrough is a billboard. Every time they see you glow, something in them dims. Every time they hear your name, their peace shivers, not because you're pursuing revenge, but because you're no longer accessible. They lost their access to something holy, like a lightning storm after drought. Your absence cracked open the silence they were once so comfortable in. Now, even the air feels heavier around them. Why? Because judgment doesn't always arrive in fire. Sometimes it shows up in the calm that follows the exit. You left, the covering lifted, and suddenly everything feels exposed. Your very existence became a spiritual echo. You had a chance. Every door that opens for you now becomes a mirror showing them the one they slammed. Every blessing becomes evidence that they mishandled something divine. Every moment of your elevation becomes a shadow over their conscience, and that's what makes you dangerous. Not your rage, not your revenge, but your release. They thought you'd chase them. Instead, you transcended. They thought you'd fall apart, but you stood still and watched God orchestrate the consequence. Just like the plague that followed Pharaoh's stubbornness, Exodus 11. Your departure marked a shift. You were the final ask to let something sacred go. And now they're reaping the result of hardened hearts, even in nature. There are creatures like the poison dart frog, beautiful, small, radiant, but untouchable. Their colors are a warning, not a decoration. That's you. Your energy was never meant to be toyed with. It was a signal, and they ignored it. You weren't the storm. You were the siren. You weren't the punishment. You were the final pause before judgment. You weren't sent to be loved by everyone. You were sent to reveal what love really is, and their response became their record. They failed the test. And now they run. Not because you're a threat, but because the truth chases them in your absence. You were never just walking through life. You were walking through prophecy. Every betrayal you endured, every season of silence you survived, every storm you passed through with bleeding hands and eyes full of fire, it all led to this moment. You were never weak. You were being sharpened. You were never invisible. You were being hidden by God for a time when your voice would shake the very systems that once tried to bury you. You were not sent to be understood. You were sent to unsettle the lies, to call out the false peace, to burn the bridges that led back to bondage. You were not here to be liked. You were chosen to be a living contradiction to everything this world says is acceptable. You carry grace and fire, truth and mystery, tenderness and terrifying spiritual clarity. You are dangerous not because of your volume, but because of your vibration. You carry divine frequency now, and no demonic distortion can counterfeit it. You didn't survive just to look pretty in the light. You survive to become the kind of force that silences gossip, chokes manipulation, and shatters every illusion that once convinced you you were unworthy. And your haters, they're not just afraid of what you'll say, they're terrified of what your peace reveals, of what your fruit confirms, of what your presence interrupts. They're watching from a distance now, speechless, because they finally see what God saw all along, that you weren't just a target, you were a trumpet. You weren't just a victim, you were a vessel. You weren't just the one they tried to break, you were the breaker of cycles, the interruption of patterns, the proof that spiritual warfare cannot stop a soul covered in divine fire. And if any part of this truth struck a chord in your spirit, don't let it stop here. Take a moment to like this message, not for me, but for the version of you that finally feels seen. Share it with someone who's still asleep in the same darkness you escaped. Comment below what this confirmed for. You don't hold back your voice anymore. Your agreement carries weight. And if you know your soul needs more of this truth, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon, because the next word might be the one that breaks your last chain. If you feel led to sow a seed into this movement through a super thanks, your support means more than you know. But know this, even if you don't give a dime, I thank you with my whole heart just for watching, for listening, for allowing this fire to meet you where you are. This journey was never just about validation. It was about awakening. It was about stepping into your prophetic identity and never apologizing again for how loud your healing sounds in rooms that are still allergic to truth. And as you walk forward from this message, walk like someone who knows their footsteps carry fire. Walk like someone who knows their scars are sacred. Walk like someone who knows they were never meant to fit in because they were sent to take ground. You were never meant to blend. You were built to break things, curses, cycles, strongholds, silence. And now that the veil is off and your identity is fully known, you don't owe anyone an explanation for the glow they can't comprehend. So I bless you. I bless the part of you that was buried too long. I bless the version of you that's just now learning to breathe without shame. I bless the fierce and fragile places in you that finally understand they were never contradictions. They were callings. And may every room you walk into from now on remember your name, not because you demanded it, but because heaven confirmed it. You are God's chosen. You are His storm in silence. And you are more dangerous than they'll ever admit. Now go, and don't just walk. Shift the ground.